Thank you. Please be seated. All rise for the jury. All right, please be seated. Members of the jury, I understand you have a verdict. Members of the jury, I will now read the verdicts as they will appear in the permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, Count 1. Court File Number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, Juror Foreperson, Juror Number 19. Same caption, verdict Count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by Jury Foreperson, Juror Number 19. Same caption, verdict Count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury Foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if these are your true and correct verdicts. Please respond yes or no. Juror Number 2, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 9, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 19, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 27, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 44, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 52, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 55, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 79, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 85, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 89, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 91, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 92, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Are these your verdicts, so say you one, so say you all?
Yes.
Members of the jury, I find that the verdicts as read reflect the will of the jury and will be filed accordingly. I have to thank you on behalf of the people of the state of Minnesota for not only jury service, but heavy-duty jury service. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to follow the deputy back into your usual room, and I will join you in a few minutes to answer questions and to advise you further. So, all rise for the jury. Be seated. With the guilty verdicts returned, we're going to have Blakely, you may file a written argument as to Blakely factors within 1 week. The court will issue findings on the Blakely factors, the factual findings, 1 week after that. We'll order a PSI immediately returnable in 4 weeks. And we will also have a briefing on, after you get the PSI, 6 weeks from now, and then 8 weeks from now we will have sentencing. We'll get you the exact dates in a scheduling order. Is there a motion on behalf of the state?
Your Honor, the state would move to have the court revoke the defendant's bail and remand him into custody pending sentencing.
Bail is revoked, bond is discharged, and the defendant is remanded to the custody of the Hennepin County Sheriff. Anything further?
Oh, Your
All
Honor.
right. Thank you. We're adjourned.
So, council, dates, I can send you.
multiracial, 6 whites, and they all came together and very quickly agreed on this verdict. This was a jury of peers, and as a result, I think that that's helpful in instilling confidence in the verdict for the community at large.
And Sonny Hostin, as we look at these images coming in from across the country, but first, of course, from Minneapolis, relief in that community. And you yourself said, as a former prosecutor yourself, when you heard that there was a verdict and this quickly, that even you had thought there would be at least questions from perhaps the jurors for the judge, and there was not. Unanimous, guilty on all charges.
Yeah. You know, David, I've been a lawyer for 27 years, and I remember when I was in law school during my first year, the Rodney King verdict came out, and it was an acquittal for 4 officers who, on video, beat and stomped and tased a man, beat a man 56 times with a baton. And I believed my eyes then. So I believed my eyes this time with George Floyd. And even though I knew that fast verdicts always hint at an agreement, even though all of my training told me that they likely convicted on at least the highest count or at least the lowest count, because of the history in this country, because it is so rare that police officers are convicted, because black men and black boys are killed by police with impunity in this country, and that is just the truth, at a rate 5 times more than their white counterparts. Because I am the mother of an 18-year-old boy who is now in South Africa, and I feel that he is safer in South Africa than he is in his own country. I am so relieved that this is what justice finally looks like for my community. And while I know that this does not bring George Floyd back to his family, to his loved ones, to his brother who we've heard from so eloquently, at least I believe now that the movement that we've seen since his murder on video for the world to see is not just a moment. I really believe that this is a movement that we've seen. And for that, I am so very thankful that perhaps we will see real change, much needed change in this country.
Sonny Hostin, with some very personal reflections on our coverage this afternoon and the guilty verdict from the jury in Minneapolis. Sonny, thank you. And when you couple what Sonny said and her observations along with what Dan Abrams said just moments before her, that perhaps this could be a unifying moment when you think about the jury and the diversity, the makeup of that jury. 6 white jurors, 6 people of color, 4 black jurors, and 2 who self-identify as multiracial, that they all deliberated together and in just a short period of time were united on what they saw when they watched those 9 minutes and what they heard over the course of 3 weeks inside that Minneapolis courtroom. You can see they have begun to put up signs in Minneapolis. That's the scene from South Minneapolis. Justice served is what that sign says underneath George Floyd's name now. They've now put that up on the sign. And my colleague, Lindsay Davis, is in Minneapolis. And Lindsay, the reaction there.
David, you know, there was a novel by Terry McMillan, subsequently a movie called Waiting to Exhale. Today it was so much more than that. That was All of Us. And just a little while ago, I was telling you about how the streets here were empty. You hardly saw any people or cars. Well, suddenly now you hear just this celebratory honking. I saw a small group of black people walk walked by who chanted Black Lives Matter. And certainly, you know, this verdict doesn't change our criminal justice system, but perhaps for some, at least for this day, if nothing more beyond that, it does send this message. And for those who consider this to be a win or a victory, perhaps they owe a debt to Darnella Frazier, the 17-year-old who shot that video, because so much was made of the prosecution's saying, but for the knee, right? And I imagine many today are saying, but for the videotape, would we find ourselves in this place today? After all, if we go back to how this started, all with a counterfeit $20 bill. A crime that Chief Arredondo testified that normally they wouldn't even take somebody into custody for. So much jubilation really on the streets here.
Lindsay Davis on the ground in Minneapolis for us as we continue our live coverage of the verdict in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. He was a veteran with the police force there in Minneapolis, a 19-year veteran, 45 years old. He's been found guilty of second-degree unintentional murder, guilty of third-degree murder, guilty of second-degree manslaughter. We're getting some color from inside that courtroom, and of course the live stream offers the country and the world a perspective that we would not have seen had we not been in this pandemic. The judge saying he was doing this live stream because the community would not be allowed to come into the courtroom and witness this trial as it unfolded. But some of what we can't see in that courtroom has just come in, and this is from the print reporter who was inside the courtroom. They're allowing a reporter or two inside that courtroom every day, but because of restrictions, just a small number of reporters. They described the scene as the judge said, all rise. The jurors entering that courtroom, we are told all of them looked serious. None of them looked emotional, or that they had been teary, or that there had been, emotions exchanged while they were deliberating. All of them, in this note that we've been given by the print reporter who was in the room, serious as they walked into the courtroom. Judge Cahill reading the verdicts on that paper as Chauvin stared at the empty witness podium. And as you saw at home, as we were carrying this live, this is the era that we're in, the face mask. There was very little reaction unless you're reading the eyes of Derek Chauvin. And I do believe we have video of the actual moment. You won't be able to see much, but here's what we saw.
Permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, Count 1. Court file number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19.
And that's the reaction from Derek Chauvin as he went through each of the counts.
Above entitled matter as to Count 2,
as you can see,
third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict Count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you
Derek Chauvin, his reaction inside that courtroom, of course wearing a mask, which makes it very difficult
juror number 2
for anyone to truly judge at home what the reaction was, though it seemed rather stoic, calm, and as he was led away from the courtroom, no resistance, and that was in the note that he stood up. That certainly his defense attorney prepared him for the very likely scenario that if he was found guilty, that the state would ask the judge to revoke bail, which is exactly what they did. And of course, given his background in law enforcement, he knew that was very likely what would happen if found guilty on really any of the charges. Those are the descriptions from inside the courtroom, and of course we'll learn more in the hours and the days to come. One of the things that we were struck by today is that even before this verdict was delivered by this jury in Minneapolis, we heard from President Biden at the White House weighing in on this case, and he said he was only weighing in, offering what he did, because he knew that the jurors in this case had been sequestered and would not hear what the president was saying. The White House revealing today that he did call the family of George Floyd in the last 24 hours. And I want to bring in our chief White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega, because, Cecilia, you were telling me just before we came on this afternoon that we were actually expecting to hear from President Biden, but that was put on hold, and we obviously assumed it was because the White House knew this was coming, not what verdict was coming, but that there was a significant development and that we would soon learn it.
And David, I know from speaking with sources over the last few weeks in the lead up to this moment that we are in as a country, that they've been trying to figure out the right way to have the president speak out and address the nation. I expect that we will hear from him at some point soon. We do know from colleagues that here in the White House who are inside the White House right now that we've seen people. Are we going to hear from him? Is that what you're telling me? Okay, not yet. But we have seen preparations, staffers at a podium. So we do expect to hear from him. I would not be surprised. We know, David, that the president has been watching this trial very closely, and that he has developed a relationship with the family of George Floyd. You mentioned that he spoke to his brother today, and the press secretary told us earlier this afternoon that this is, of course, a president who knows intimately what it means to live with grief, and he has that connection with the family of George Floyd, and that the president himself has said that he developed a connection with them. But he did make these controversial comments earlier this morning when the president said that he believed that the evidence against Chauvin was overwhelming and that he was praying for the right verdict. The White House would not clarify when they were pushed on what that right verdict meant. But David, we know what President Biden has said all along, that he believes that George Floyd was murdered, but that he believed he suffered at the hands of brutality in his death. So we also know, though, that we heard that warning from the judge in the courtroom, Judge Cahill, just yesterday, that he warned politicians against making statements on this case for fear that it would taint the jury, even though they are sequestered. The president and the White House have said that he would not have made this statement like this if they were not, in fact, that jury was not sequestered. So they tried to sort of back away from that. But we have heard from defense attorneys in many cases that they believe that it isn't appropriate for politicians to comment and weigh in ahead of jury verdicts for fear that they could end up being part of an appeal. It is extremely unusual to hear from a president in a case like this one. Nonetheless, we are here, David. We are waiting from word from the White House when and if we will hear from the president address the nation. I expect that to happen.
And one more point I wanted to ask you about, Cecilia. One more thing that the president said, and I know that you monitored this as well, is that he said that he knew that the jury was under significant weight in this case, that they were aware of what they were going to be deliberating over. He said, I'm praying the verdict is the right verdict, but he also said, I can only imagine the pressure and anxiety they're feeling, and so I waited until the jury was sequestered before I called George Floyd's family. And we heard, Cecilia, from the judge in this case, too, as he thanked them for their service. And this is going to be an extraordinary part of the story that unfolds over the course of the next few days, the weight that these jurors felt, but the judge thanking them for the heavy-duty jury service from those jurors.
Exactly. And President Biden touching on that. You know, David, this is a moment in our country that we are living in as a country collectively that is not lost on this White House, that is not lost on this president, not just what the jury, not just what everybody in that courtroom went through, not just what the people of Minneapolis and that community and the family are going through, but what this country is going through. And just think back to the campaign. This is a man who campaigned on racial reckoning, who said he got into this race because of what happened in Charlottesville under President Trump. He was propelled in large part, into office by the help of African-American voters in this country. That is how he won the nomination. So he feels the weight of this moment and this cultural reckoning that we are in. But David, there is also a political side to this as well. He promised police reform. He promised action on police reform on day one, and that has yet to happen. Instead, he is not backing a police commission that he said he would, a study commission. He is instead hoping on action on Capitol Hill that is stalled right now, David.
Cecilia Vega, monitoring developments from the White House. If and when we hear from President Biden, we will go right back to Cecilia. I should mention that many of our stations in the East might be joining their local news broadcasts, but we will continue until 6 p.m. Eastern. So should we hear from the president, we will bring that to you live. We will also bring you the Minnesota Attorney General, Keith Ellison, should he speak before we go off the air at 6 for local news here in the East, and then I'll be back on at 6:30 with our entire team. I wanted to bring in our senior national correspondent, Steve Osunsama. You heard Cecilia talk about the campaign, and we cannot forget that this all played out not only during the pandemic, but in the middle of a presidential campaign, and one of the most, if not the most, highly charged campaigns of modern American history. And as Cecilia pointed out, this was something that President Biden did not shy away from. He talked about this reckoning in America, this conversation in America, and he said it was a conversation that was long overdue, Steve.
It's frankly one of the reasons why Joe Biden was able to get so many votes here in Georgia, because of that issue. That racial reckoning that happened after this incident not only affected our political world, it affected our workplaces, it affected our interpersonal relationships. And, I want to underline something here. You're seeing a lot of pictures of people celebrating, fist pumping, jumping in the air. But I want to underline that the thing that they're celebrating isn't the defeat of a police officer. It's the acknowledgement that in this incident, a black life that many Americans felt wasn't going to get its proper respect and due was recognized, and the jurors saw that and sided with what should have been, sided with what was justice, actually determined that what you saw, that the sky was blue, yes, indeed, the sky was blue. That's what I think people are celebrating in the street, and what you're going to hear people celebrating. And, as much as the jury, we all expected, of course, the jury to come back and have its say, we knew that America was going to have its say as well. The streets were going to react to this, and the streets are reacting right now with a sense of relief, with a sense of justice, with a sense of equality achieved, because so many of these cases, David, you and I have reported on many of these incidents where there was video, where it seemed as clear as day, and because of people's feelings about police officers, the officer was not acquitted, or it was a hung jury. That didn't happen in this case. You're hearing people chant Black Lives Matter, because that's really what this was all about. That was the heart of it. David?
Steve Osunsama, who covered the presidential campaign and who covered it from a local level right there in Georgia, and the wide impact that state had, the voters in that state, their voices, shifting power in Washington on a number of levels. I want to bring in Ken Moten, who's reporting from Minneapolis for us. And Ken, you learned of late developments involving George Floyd's family.
The moment Philonise Floyd, George Floyd's younger brother, walked out of that courtroom, we understand he got a call from President Biden. In fact, we just watched a live stream, a social media live stream, David, from one of the family attorneys, where President Biden was essentially congratulating George Floyd's family, also family attorney Ben Crump, and he even referenced what George Floyd's daughter said last summer, that her daddy changed the world, is going to change the world. And so that was a personal conversation the two had. It was on a social media live stream, but we understand, yes, President Biden has reached out to the family. Philonise Floyd actually spoke to the president before the verdict as well. We know that when it comes to President Biden, he has suffered tremendous loss himself. And so he spoke from that viewpoint, from that aspect. And it was words of comfort to the family as well. But when it comes to inside that courtroom, David, we're hearing also that Philonise Floyd was inside. He was the family member who was inside. There's been at least one family member inside that courtroom every single day over the course of this trial. And as Philonise Floyd heard that verdict, guilty, 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 he had his hands clasped over his head, and he became shakier and shakier as he heard each count there, guilty. Also, family members are gathered inside a hotel here in downtown Minneapolis. Tears of joy, David, is what we understand, chanting George Floyd's name, just like the demonstrators on these streets, chanting that name over and over again, also saying it's an unbelievable feeling in that room. You mentioned Terrence Floyd, David, that you interviewed last summer. He said he was nervous, angry, but there's this relief that he feels right now. And when it comes to Chauvin being taken away in handcuffs, the family was chanting Yes, that's right. Take him away. This is the moment they've been waiting for so long. They've gotten a big settlement. They've gotten a lot of support from the family, but this is what they were waiting for. And now as we await to hear from the family within the next few minutes or so, David, we understand they're going on to the next chapter of making sure they take this to the next level when it comes to legislation and police reform. David.
Next steps from the family, pushing for new legislation, and as Kenneth Moten just reported, police reform. But perhaps the biggest headline out of Ken Moten's reporting there in Minneapolis is that President Biden called George Floyd's family in the moments after this verdict was delivered in that courtroom, guilty on all counts. And we remember when we were broadcasting World News Tonight from Houston on the eve of the funeral for George Floyd, that it was then former Vice President Joe Biden, the presidential candidate at the time, who traveled to Houston to meet with Floyd's family. He met George Floyd's youngest daughter, met with the family on the day before the funeral, and we remember that during the funeral, there was a videotaped message then delivered from Joe Biden. This has been a long conversation over the course of the better part of a year between Joe Biden, who is now the president, and the family of George Floyd. He has not shied away from his support for this family, offering words on this trial, as Cecilia reported a short time ago, only after the president said that he knew the jurors were sequestered and beginning their difficult work of deliberating, but that he hoped that there would be the right verdict. The White House was pressed today by reporters what the president meant by that. They would not elaborate. Though, as Cecilia pointed out, the president clearly not fearful of how Americans would read that, his choice of words in the hours earlier today before we heard the verdict. I want to bring back in Deborah Roberts, if she's still with us, just because of something that struck me earlier when you were talking about having talked to your son again about this last night, Deb. You know, the video's been out there all year long, but it doesn't get any easier to watch over the course of this trial, and that your son often still looks away to this day because parents across this country are going to be reacting to the news of this verdict and having conversations with their families all over again tonight.
I think you're right, David, and I think that's what makes it so difficult, and that's why my friend and colleague Sunny Hostin, I think, just sort of lost her composure, and I so get that, because I think what was so clear here for so many people, whether you're a mother of color or just a person in general watching this, is that, you know, George Floyd was a man whose life should have had value. And yes, he was an imperfect man. He was struggling with the drug addiction and he had other problems in his life. But I think so many of us, and probably Sonny included, looked at that videotape, you know, with a gun in his face and the way he was treated so quickly over, you know, a fraudulent $20 bill. I think so many of us looked at that and we saw our own sons, our own brothers, our own husbands and family members. And you sort of thought that, you know, it sort of represented, I think, sort of this lack of value of a life of somebody of color. And as Steve Osunsami pointed out, David, you and I and all of us have reported on other situations where maybe a white man had an encounter with police. I certainly reported on one where he pulled a gun on the police and he was not shot. He was taken into custody peacefully because they wanted to take him into custody peacefully, and they went out of their way not to shoot him. And I think for those of us in the media, we've had opportunities to see cases like that, and maybe people at home don't necessarily think about it and process it that way. But I think for so many of us looking at that videotape over and over again of George Floyd, just so quickly the situation escalating, and you know he's screaming and plaintively asking for, you know, mercy, simply to be taken into custody in a way that was I think that was fair. And I think so many of us felt that, and I think that's the core of the emotion here, that it didn't have to be that way and it didn't have to escalate that way. It wasn't about whether George Floyd was a perfect man. It was really about the fact that he was a man and he should have been treated as such. And I think for a lot of people, this resonates as sort of a victory in the sense that we need to start regarding people, you know, as people and treating them with humanity and respect. And, you know, for once people saw justice and saw somebody being held into account because of how that was handled. And I think that at the core is what a lot of people will be feeling and talking about tonight. And maybe actually, as Lindsay said, exhaling a little bit tonight, thinking that maybe the system can recognize bad behavior sometimes on the place of law enforcement. So I think that is, David, something that will be resonating and being talked about a lot tonight.
Deborah Roberts with us for our coverage this afternoon. And as Deb points out, the conversation begins in homes across the country, probably right now as we're on the air, now that we've learned the verdict here this afternoon. And as we heard Ken Moten report just moments ago, President Biden reaching out to the family of George Floyd after the verdict was read. We have not heard publicly from the president yet, but we have learned that he has talked with George Floyd's family. I want to bring in our senior congressional correspondent, Rachel Scott, who I believe is at Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. Of course, that was created in the aftermath of what happened to George Floyd and the effort to push for reform and for justice. And Rachel, you heard what Ken Moten said there a moment ago, that this doesn't necessarily end this chapter, that the Floyd family believes that this is the beginning of a conversation, and that the next part of this conversation is, how do we make change in this country?
That's exactly right, David. I mean, I'm standing here in Black Lives Matter Plaza, a plaza that now has the words Black Lives Matter printed in bold yellow letters on this block leading up to the White House. But activists, Black people in this country, want more than just a symbol. They want change, and they want that to come through legislation. We heard Cecilia Vega talk about police reform in this country being stalled. We saw those conversations about police reform from bipartisan group of lawmakers. Those went nowhere after the death of George Floyd. We're seeing those talks sort of resume again, but they want more from this White House. They want more from lawmakers in Congress. Just moments after this verdict was read, I watched one young Black man just fall to his knees in tears here, overcome with emotion. I just talked to him. He told me he was out here over the summer as those protests over racial reckoning erupted in this country. He says that he saw himself in George Floyd. And today, David, I'm also thinking about moments that we were on the air during George Floyd's funeral. I remember being out here, and I remember a group of protesters were here, and they started with the name of George Floyd, but then they went down the names of other Black lives that have been taken at the hands of police. Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, so many others. And that really struck to the heart of what this movement is about. It is about change. Every person that comes out here, people that are gathering here right now, they have stories. They have stories in which they have experienced racial inequality in this country. I remember being out here night after night during the summer, talking to families who brought their children here to have those tough conversations about race in this country, about what it means to be white in America, about what it means to be Black in America. But David, every single person that I spoke with said that they wanted change, and that change comes through legislation. Many here today feel like we took one step forward towards that change, David. Rachel Scott reporting from Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington. A relatively peaceful scene, though she described in great detail witnessing one young Black man who fell to his knees in reaction to the verdict here this afternoon. I know that Good Morning America's Michael Strahan has been watching this unfold this afternoon right here along with us. Michael, what do you make of what you've learned here this afternoon, and what's your reaction?
Well, David, I appreciate you having me on, and I think my reaction is looking at the verdict, and you feel that it is justified. You feel maybe this is the changing of the tide. Hopefully, you no longer get away with killing a Black person, no matter who you are in society, not just as a police officer, but for anyone. And you look at this case, and it definitely, Black people in America have been, treated in a different way when it comes to dealing with the police. But this is also about just humanity as a whole. To see this as a human being, it was disturbing. And at the end of it all, I think that you see people celebrating and you see people are happy, but it does not bring George Floyd back. It does not, bring any. Anything. You had Breonna Taylor, you had Philando Castile, you had all these others who did not get the justice that we see here in the case of George Floyd, but he still has a family who still have to suffer through the fact that, yes, their verdict is guilty, but yet he will never walk through their door again. But I think, as a whole, as a Black man in this country, and being, as Black people in this country, we feel that hopefully this is a changing of the guard, like a change that will show that people of color will be treated with the respect and the dignity of everyone else, and it won't be an afterthought. We won't be surprised when something like this happens and the verdict is guilty. we won't be on the edge of our seat hoping that the verdict is guilty when it's very hard to understand how it couldn't be. So I just think that this is a feeling of hope, but yet I want everybody to keep in mind that there's still a family that's grieving the loss of a brother, a father, and a son, and those things will never go away from that family, regardless of what this verdict does. But it is so good to see that the justice system has made the right decision in this case, and that hopefully this is something that rings and makes change for the future of the minorities in this country.
Michael Strahan reporting in this afternoon, and Michael making an extraordinarily profound point there, that it is important that we all remember that there is a family at the heart of this case and at the heart of this trial, George Floyd's family, and even though we saw their reaction that they do believe justice has been served, that it certainly doesn't bring back their father, their brother, their son. Michael Strahan, our thanks to you. We do know that we heard just moments ago from Minnesota's Attorney General Keith Ellison. Here's what he had to say.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith Ellison. I'm the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. And since the investigation and prosecution of this case began last May, everyone involved has pursued one goal: justice. We pursued justice wherever it led. When I became the lead prosecutor for the case, I asked for time and patience to review the facts, gather evidence, and prosecute for the murder of George Floyd to the fullest extent the law allowed. I want to thank the community for giving us that time and allowing us to do our work.
The Minnesota Attorney General there, Keith Ellison, talking to the community there, thanking the jury for doing their work, and the community. Certainly they had been bracing, not only there in Minnesota and in Minneapolis, for any possible outcome and any potential reaction to that outcome. And so far, obviously, what you're seeing from right there in South Minneapolis, that is the corner where this played out a year ago, Memorial Day, George Floyd Square in front of Cup Foods, the shrine to George Floyd, and you saw the hugs and some tears right after the verdict was read from that community. And as we heard from Lindsay Davis earlier, as we were on the air, the immediate change in temperature in Minneapolis, on the streets of Minneapolis, that people exhaled, if you will. That was the word that Lindsay used to describe the moment. I want to bring in Cecilia Vega because, Cecilia, we did learn from Ken Moten that President Biden did reach out to George Floyd's family, and we are aware that this has been a relationship that the president has forged with this family, not just now, not just during this trial, but all the way back to when the country and the world witnessed this video. He went to meet with them in Houston on the eve of that funeral. And he's kept in contact with this family ever since.
He has, David. They spoke this morning. They just spoke again. We found out from Kenneth Moten. And I do have a little bit of breaking news from the White House just in to tell you about. We don't have many details, but I am told by the White House that the president and the vice president will deliver remarks later this evening, they say, on the verdict. So clearly that is going to happen at some point later this evening. But, you know, this is something that we have heard from this White House and frankly from this president himself. This is not something that he shies away from. The personal grief and the personal tragedy that he has lived in his own life, having lost children, having lost a wife so tragically young, just as he was being sworn in as a senator here in Washington all those years ago. And this is a president who very much governs as an empathetic ear. As someone who connects one-on-one with people and who does not shy away from having those difficult conversations. And in his own memoirs, he has talked about that is how he relates, and that is how he thinks when he is inside a building like this one, or when he governed all those years in the Senate, as someone who is empathetic, who can really understand the grief and the sadness that people go through. And he talks often to families who are living through such awful tragedies, like the one that the George Floyd family has gone through, that one day there will come a time, he hopes for them, that there will be a smile on their face when they remember those loved ones, that smile and those happy memories will overshadow the sad ones. And that is, I'm sure, part of the conversation that he has had with this family. We talked earlier about the controversy, the president weighing in on this verdict before the verdict actually happened, saying that he was praying for the right verdict. I think we know where the president's mind and heart was on what the outcome that he wanted to see, even though the White House wouldn't fill in the blanks. But again, David, we do expect to hear from the president and the vice president at some point sooner than later. And the vice president, I will say, did an interview earlier today where she said that this verdict will not heal the pain that has existed for generations. And that is a point that we should make here, that my colleagues who have been reporting on this story for going on a year now, that this verdict doesn't end this conversation that needs to keep happening in this country about reform and policing and justice. And I'm certain that that is something the president will hit on today.
Cecilia Vega at the White House. We just learned from Cecilia moments ago that President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris will have comments on this verdict, public comments, in the hours to come from Washington. We do know that the president talked with the family of George Floyd, a relationship that he struck up with them since not long after this tragedy, which takes us back into the months leading up to the election, of course. I want to bring in Nightline anchor Byron Pitts because as we were talking about with Cecilia there, Byron, it reminds me of part of the case that the prosecution made, that they said that this was not an anti-police prosecution, that this was about former officer Derek Chauvin. And in trying to make that point, they put up a visual inside the courtroom showing all of the faces of the police witnesses who testified against Derek Chauvin. That was extremely rare to see in a case of alleged police misconduct. We now know that the jury has found him guilty, but extremely rare to see the number of faces and no particular order, although the police chief himself saying that he did not act in accordance with police policy. Very strong words from the police department. And I gather, as Cecilia points out, this is also going to be a conversation that continues and one with political undertones to it. And the president will likely have to thread the needle, essentially, I gather, making a similar case to what we heard from the prosecution, that this isn't an anti-police moment in this country, but that this was about an officer accused of wrongdoing and now found guilty by a jury, a very diverse jury in Minneapolis.
That's right, David. A diverse American jury believed their eyes. And frankly, that's been rare in American history in major moments, that black and white America see the same event and have the same reaction to it. I have a few thoughts, David. I was thinking about what the prosecutor, Jerry Blackwell, said yesterday to your point about law enforcement. He said being a cop in America, it's about in your custody, in your care, not in your custody, I don't care. So I think this verdict certainly sends a message to law enforcement across this nation about what the public expects of them. I'm also mindful of what Dr. King said in March of 1968. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I would think for people who were satisfied by today's verdict that justice found its sweet spot. And David, lastly, I'm mindful of something, though, that one of the demonstrators, protesters said. A woman gathered down there at George Floyd Square said, as we saw the images of people reacting, the woman said the healing work begins. And I think that's worth noting. For all the optimism that many people may feel in this moment, history has shown us for every success, there are setbacks. I think about, that pivotal moment in American history when Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech in 1963. 18 days later, though, there was a bombing at a Birmingham church and 4 girls died. So in many ways, this trial was hard. Watching that videotape was hard. But the healing work that woman spoke of, history has shown that is equally hard, if not more difficult. So yes, as Dr. King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So perhaps we did find justice today, but there is so much work to be done in police stations, in courtrooms, in corporations across this nation, in homes across this nation. So significant night today, but so much work to come.
Byron Pitts of Nightline. Byron, always great to have you help guide the way here with us as we're on the air. You're watching ABC News live coverage of the verdict in the trial against former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, obviously a short time ago found guilty on all 3 counts, found guilty of second-degree unintentional murder, guilty of third-degree murder, guilty of second-degree manslaughter. As I've been explaining as we go, this trial has been different in many ways because it's playing out in the middle of a pandemic. The judge making the rare decision to live stream the trial, which allowed the country and really the world to watch. Of course, we did not see the jurors, and we do have what we call the pool report from the reporter who was allowed in that room, describing the jurors walking into that room rather stoically, no emotion on their face, extremely serious, describing the former police officer Chauvin studying them, studying the judge as he read the verdict, and then getting up very calmly as he was handcuffed and then escorted out of that courtroom. We heard in the moments right before that the state asking the judge to revoke bail, which we knew they would do if he was found guilty on any of these charges, and of course on all three. And he was guided out of that courtroom. As we mentioned with Dan Abrams earlier in our coverage, he will be sentenced based on the most serious of those three charges. That's in accordance with Minnesota law. He faces potentially decades behind bars. And Dan Abrams suggested that perhaps as part of that sentencing, they will use what the prosecution used in their rebuttal, basically going back to the 9-year-old girl. There were so many witnesses there that day, but going back to that 9-year-old girl who said she listened in 9 minutes, 29 seconds into that moment. The paramedics then arriving, Derek Chauvin still with his knee to George Floyd's neck, and that 9-year-old girl said she could hear paramedics having to tell Chauvin, get off of him. You know, Byron Pitts making the point there that this was a diverse jury, that this was an all-American jury, if you will. 6 white jurors, 4 black jurors, and 2 people who described themselves as multiracial. Perhaps that will offer a unifying message as the country digests the verdict in this case and as we begin the conversation about what comes next. I wanted to bring in Terry Austin of the Law and Crime Network because, Terry, in addition to the jury, we heard the defense make that case in the last 24 hours, and they did this throughout the trial. They tried to characterize the bystanders there as potential as potential threats to Derek Chauvin, certainly at the very least a distraction to Derek Chauvin. Then we heard that rebuttal from the prosecution, and I'm curious if you think that that rebuttal had any impact, because obviously they have now decided the way they have. They've agreed with the prosecution, but there was that point that he made when he said those bystanders, those witnesses, a threat. And he basically said, come on, I mean, you saw them. And he pointed out to the jury that you met almost all of those bystanders who had come in as witnesses. And Terry, we all witnessed, as the nation watched this trial, very emotional testimony from each one of them about what they witnessed. And the faces of those witnesses represented all different backgrounds in this country.
There is no question that on rebuttal, when Jerry Blackwell mentioned the fact that that crowd was there with the jury, that crowd took the pictures, they witnessed what happened, and they told you as a jury that this was wrong, that this should not be happening. We have a 9-year-old girl who said, just get up off of him. I definitely think that was very impactful. And frankly, I believe that those witnesses who are hearing this verdict are happy. They understand that they did their part in this process. They came forward, they told the truth, they were listened to, and I think it's going to affect the entire judicial system, and it will have an incredible impact on the world. Here we are seeing finally that individuals are being held individually accountable for their actions, not just passing laws, and those are important, not just having police reform, and that is important, but actually having a police officer being held personally accountable for having used excessive force against an individual of color. I think finally we can sigh a breath of relief, and I think finally we are at a tipping point. And I'll add one last thing. I am here in Harlem. When the guilty verdict came out on all 3 counts, you could hear all of Harlem cheering. And that is only the second time that I've heard that. The first time was when we saw Joe Biden get voted for president. And so I think it is astronomical that this is happening, and I think the world is reacting.
Terry, stick with us here. I just have a note for our audience. For those of you watching, we know that many of our stations might pull away for their 6 o'clock local news. For the rest of the country, we will be staying on with our live coverage, ABC News live coverage of the verdict in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, found guilty today on all charges. And for those of you who will be going to local news, I'll see you at 6:30 right afterward. In the meantime, Terry, I wanted to come back to you because I wanted your reaction to something we've just learned. Darnella Frazier, who of course captured that video, that was the most important piece of evidence, obviously, in this case. You know, the prosecution had several main pillars in their argument, but the most significant pillar of all was, of course, the 9 minutes, 29 seconds that they were able to play of that video, more than 8 minutes of it in their opening statement. Darnella Frazier, who captured that video, Terry, this is what she just sent out in a tweet, I believe. She said, "I just cried so hard this last hour. My heart was beating so fast. I was anxious, anxiety through the roof. But to know guilty on all 3 charges, thank you, God. Thank you." And we heard her testify on that witness stand that she has felt guilty since that Memorial Day in South Minneapolis, that she was not able to do more. And today, as you heard right there, she is so grateful, she says, for guilty on all 3 charges.
And I think the other witnesses who came forward will also feel some sort of relief. Obviously, we cannot bring George Floyd back, but I think for the other witnesses who said that they wish that they had done more, obviously the fact that they came in and they testified, they made a difference, and the jury heard them loudly and clearly. And it was very smart on the part of the prosecution to bring that back in to his closing statement, because the jury really needed to hear that. And I'm grateful that Darnella Frazier learned that this was a guilty verdict on all counts and that she's relieved. And I'm hoping and thinking that the others in that crowd will have some sense of relief, and the family also will have some sense of relief. Obviously, they'll never be the same again, but I do think that having this guilty verdict really makes a difference. I remember when George Floyd's daughter was being held up on, I think it was her uncle's shoulders, and she said, "My father made a difference." Her father really has made a difference. This is clearly a tipping point, and I think perhaps going forward, we will see more guilty verdicts when the evidence supports exactly that.
Terry Austin with us from the Law and Crime Network. Terry, thank you, and stick with us here as our coverage continues. We are just learning at this hour of a statement from former President Barack Obama, and I know we're expecting a statement later this evening from President Biden and from Vice President Kamala Harris. But President Obama saying today a jury in Minneapolis did the right thing. He goes on to say, for almost a year, George Floyd's death under the knee of a police officer has reverberated around the world, inspiring murals, marches, sparking conversations in living rooms and new legislation. The former president says, but a more basic question has always remained, would justice be done? He said, in this case, at least, we have our answer. And he said, Michelle and I send our prayers to the Floyd family. That just in from former President Barack Obama on the verdict in Minneapolis late today. I want to bring in Lindsay Davis, who is on the ground in Minneapolis with us, our Sunday night anchor, of course, and the anchor of ABC News Live. And Lindsay, you were telling us earlier that you heard it, you could sense it almost immediately, the relief in Minneapolis.
Quite a bit of calm now. You can imagine at least that the businesses will be able to take the boards down. Perhaps the $1 million that Hennepin County spent on security, perhaps that was all for naught. And just this palpable sense that you could feel that this was the city on edge. All of a sudden now it's just a kind of a collective calm, if you will. But, you know, certainly the potential for riot was there. If history is any indicator, if you look at in the case of like Arthur McDuffie, for example, who was beaten to death by police in 1979, it wasn't until 1980, after those officers were acquitted, that the riots broke out. Similarly with Rodney King, it was the same thing. He was beaten in 1991, but the riot happened in LA in 1992. And as we heard from the Minnesota governor, who was ramping up, preparing for all possibilities, he was trying to allow for people to say, hey, look, it may not just be that this is anger, that this is riot, that this in some cases is pain and heartbreak. And as Martin Luther King said, I know Byron quoted him once, but it feels fitting to do it again. He talked about how a riot is the language of the unheard. And so perhaps, David, today, no riot, perhaps people are feeling heard.
not only there in Minneapolis, but perhaps a sense of relief across this nation that there is relative calm after a very lengthy trial, 3 weeks, 14 days of testimony over the course of those 3 weeks, and after a year of a racial reckoning, long overdue conversation in this country about race, justice, policing in this country, and very serious questions about how we bridge the divide, how we keep the conversation going, how we begin, as the Floyd family said right after this verdict, the next chapter. Rachel Scott alluding to, and Kenneth Moton also reporting on their hope that there will be legislation that pushes the conversation forward with continued reform in this country. Terrence Floyd, the brother of George Floyd, one member of the family who's also been out with protesters. We have video that has just come in of him reacting with loved ones. As we saw earlier, so many of the loved ones watching very closely from George Floyd's family. We are told that Terrence Floyd also reacting to the news with emotion and joy that his brother has seen justice.
Signed juror foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 2. We, the jury in the above entitled matter, as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty.
Yeah, come on, man. Yeah, come on, one more time. Come on, boy.
As we have seen in these reactions, they watched along with America with that pause in between each of the charges. And now the tears as the family recognizes that that jury listened to 3 weeks of testimony and found Derek Chauvin guilty on all of the charges in this case. I remember back in Brooklyn, the family gathered there almost a year ago, George Floyd telling me that he was moved by the crowd. I remember him saying black, white, Asian American, Latino, that meant so much to the Floyd family, that this was a call and a conversation being driven by families in small towns and cities across America, that this was a united conversation. This is Black Lives Matter Plaza, an image of someone kneeling there after the verdict, and we heard Rachel Scott report earlier that she was particularly moved by the reaction as it came in, and Martha Raddatz also watching this along with us in Washington. And Martha, you were out covering the streets shortly after this tragedy unfolded last Memorial Day, and the juxtaposition between the police presence and the families from all different backgrounds, and there was, even though such heartbreak at the time, also a hope on some level from everybody that we would be able to move this conversation forward.
Absolutely, David. And you know, I walked down to Black Lives Matter Plaza a few hours before the verdict came in. It's a beautiful day in Washington, as you can see from that photograph. You look behind that photograph, that's the White House. And I couldn't help think of those moments last year when they attacked protesters, when police went after those protesters in Black Lives Matter Plaza before it was named that, and the progress that has been made. Those police officers told not to respond like that anymore, to be far more careful. There was a helicopter hovering over the protesters that night. Those helicopter crews have been disciplined in some way. But I also think about what you said at the very beginning of our coverage today, David, that it was a reckoning of race, justice, and policing, and we have talked about that so much this afternoon. But when I listened to that defense attorney, in particular yesterday, talk about Derek Chauvin and what he did during that period of time with George Floyd, he talked about George Floyd as if he was an enemy, not a citizen, an enemy, not a civilian, an enemy. And talked about how Derek Chauvin kept responding in different ways and had to reassess and figure out what was going on in that angry crowd. The job of police, said the prosecutor, is to protect with courage, to serve with compassion. And also, David, I just want to talk about that video. And Sonny Hostin so beautifully talked about the history of this and seeing that Rodney King video. This video of George Floyd was so intimate. In many cases, there isn't video. That's the progress this nation needs. That's what we need to see. Just a few weeks ago, an Army veteran who was in uniform was pulled over for some minor violation. He had both hands out the window. You could tell he was terrified. African-American officer in the Army, and he was pepper sprayed. There is video of that. Thankfully, he wasn't injured beyond that. But those videos make such a powerful difference. But again, we hope that someday as a country, this doesn't happen, even if there is no video.
Well, Martha Raddatz makes an interesting point there when she talks about the defense attorney in the closing argument yesterday and his treatment through words of George Floyd on that ground. You know, it was the defense attorney's choice to play that video over and over again as he tried to make his closing argument. And there will be debate moving forward about whether or not that helped or hurt actually with jurors watching that all over again. Extraordinarily difficult video watching George Floyd on the ground. And as the prosecution then rebutted that moment, Martha, reacting the same way that you just described by saying that in custody means in the care of police there that day in South Minneapolis. And part of their reaction to the defense's closing argument, too, the defense attorney trying to say that you're constantly reassessing the situation. You have to take into account what came before those 9 minutes. Prosecution simply saying that Derek Chauvin had 9 minutes on top of George Floyd to reassess over and over again whether or not that was necessary force. And obviously, the jury deciding unanimously and within a short period of time that that was excessive force, that it violated policy, and that they agreed with not only the police chief, but several police witnesses who came forward in this case in a very rare move to testify against one of their own. I want to bring in Alex Perez because we've talked so much about the jurors here. And Alex, you know the extraordinary measures that they took in Minneapolis to protect those jurors, to guide them out with a heavy security presence. And then once the deliberations began, obviously sequestered in a hotel somewhere there in Minneapolis. But I was struck by what the judge said there when he thanked those jurors. He said, thank you for your service, for your heavy-duty jury service.
Yeah, David, the judge throughout this entire trial made it a point to make sure that the jury is a priority, that they're going to be giving these very important instructions that they need to follow, and they want the attorneys and everyone else in the courtroom to also abide by the rules that they're supposed to follow. They were escorted in and out of the courtroom every day throughout this trial, out of the public's view. As you mentioned, once they began deliberating, they were sequestered. And so the judge charged them with this task of reaching a decision in this case, and he was very careful, telling them not to watch the news, not to follow social media, to make sure that they're focusing on the facts. And he thanked them at the end, as you said, because I think he believes they listened to him and they followed all of those rules. And on a case like this one, where the pressure is really so high, I think he was grateful to them for their service. And David, you know, we've been seeing these images of George Floyd Square, all of those people gathering there. And I think that's one of the things that sort of stood out from those closing arguments yesterday. You know, the prosecutor took this case, they had this video that we've all seen, but they didn't rely just on the video. They brought in all of these people who were in that neighborhood, who recorded these images, and they let the jury meet them through their testimony. Minute by minute, they explained what they saw happening in that neighborhood. And we saw the defense attorney, during his closing arguments, try to discredit some of those witnesses, saying, you know, this is a high crime neighborhood, sort of casting some sort of doubt on what these people were saying. But we had the video, we saw the images, and I think the jury had made up their mind. They knew who those voices were that you hear on those images in that video. They knew who those people were, and they knew that they were trying to help someone who was in need of help in that moment, something that they do not believe Derek Chauvin did for George Floyd when all of this unfolded. I also heard people there at George Floyd Square, right after this all happened, David, they started screaming, yelling, let the healing begin. As we've been seeing all of this unfold over the last year, these protests across the country, people are angry. There's a lot of emotion. They want to see change. But at the end of it, I always remember people saying, I want us to heal. I want us to move forward as one. And perhaps, just perhaps, this verdict that we saw today, this could be the beginning of that, David.
Alex Perez reporting from the very beginning of this case in Minneapolis and then throughout the trial, reporting there just moments ago, let the healing begin, were the words that he heard there in Minneapolis following this verdict. There is reaction coming in from all over the world as we await public comment from President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, the White House indicating a short time ago that they will be speaking in the hour or hours ahead here this evening. If and when they speak, we, of course, will bring it to you right away. In the meantime, we've heard from former President Barack Obama, and we're now hearing from leaders overseas. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson reacting moments ago, saying, I was appalled by the death of George Floyd and welcome this verdict. My thoughts tonight are with George Floyd's family and friends. And this is Ben Crump you're looking at. He's become a familiar face in this case. Let's listen. Representing the family.
His law partner, Attorney Justin Miller, Attorney Madeline Simmons, a great Minnesota lawyers, Attorney Jeff Storms, raise your hand, Jeff, Attorney Michelle Godot, and who else we got here? Anybody else? Attorney. We have Attorney Scott Masterson, who's not present. Attorney Babani. I said Michelle. We got Michelle. All right. And just a great group of lawyers. And I want to let you know who we have present here with the family here in Minneapolis for this historic day. We have George Floyd's brothers. We have Philonise Floyd. We have Rodney Floyd. We have Brandon Williams, who's George Floyd's nephew, but was more like a son to him. They call him Woo back in the Third Ward. Woo, 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 woo. We have Keita Floyd, Philonice's wife. We have... Oh, where Terrence at? Terrence, New York, where you at? We got Terrence Floyd. His sisters who are not with us, but we should absolutely acknowledge Bridget Floyd, who hails from North Carolina, his sisters LaTanya and Jaja, who hail from Houston, Texas. We have his cousins, Sharita McGee, Hara Brown, and we have we have Roxy Washington, and we have